It's a piñon forest with mixed chaparral in the open areas. Less juniper than there was further down because this area has a bit more moisture. And so we're going to first step over here and take a look at what's on the ground. Freshly fallen pine nuts, but what is usually the case is that these are all duds. And somehow squirrels know how to figure that out. I would imagine weight is a big part of that. Occasionally you can find a good one on the ground, but these have probably all been gone through fastidiously by the local squirrels. So what some people do is, and even though squirrels of course can get them from the trees, but when they're first opening, people will smack the trees with a stick, a long thin stick, firm stick, and knock the pine cones to the ground. There's a bit of a difference between harvesting seeds that have already fallen to the ground and those that are pulled out from the either just recently opened pine cone or the unopened pine cone. And the big difference is the flavor. So if it is an abundant year where there's more on the ground than the squirrels or whomever can eat, then picking them off the ground, you're going to be relieved of that piney flavor. For me, that's preferable. And that's the traditional way for most Navajo gatherers of piñon nuts. And then there's a way that they can be roasted, salted and roasted, so that with this relatively thin-shelled species of Pinus monophylla, you can essentially just eat the whole thing. And that's especially tasty when it's been salted. So the cultivated pine nuts of commerce, which I believe generally come from Italy, but probably also from China, those nuts have been shelled, and so we're eating just the fatty meats of the nut, not the shell itself. But in the Southwest, that is one of the ways it's traditionally consumed. I can't speak to any nutritional benefits of the shell other than it being fiber of some sort, indigestible fiber that could possibly feed our gut bacteria. But I know that I've eaten a lot of them on long drives throughout the Southwest. That's one of my favorite things to eat: salted and roasted pine nuts. So just because you see pine nuts on the ground, don't get too excited about gathering them. Check them first to see if any of them have actually grown nut. And none of these so far that look clean and recently have fallen out of the cone are proving to have any nut meats inside. They're all what I would call duds. So that's where the nut would be, in this little casing here, but it's just full of air. So it obviously wasn't fertilized. That's what I wanted to point out about pine. So piñon is the distinction between an edible nut and our other relatively taller pine species in the Southwest, like ponderosa, Arizona pine, limber pine, Mexican pine, Southwest white pine. And they all have needles. This species looks a little bit more like a fir at first, because it just has one needle coming off, but off the stem, just has one needle coming off the stem, but those needles are fascicled. However, the fascicles are, I forget the technical botanical word, I don't think it's dehiscent, but they come off easily so that they don't persist. So it's a bit confusing to see it as a pine, but this is piñon pine, Pinus monophylla. The needles make a pleasant tasting tea that's also beneficial to the lungs. Also identifiable by its cinnamon brown bark on the brown bark, darker brown. And underneath this particular piñon pine, we have a species of silk tassel. Probably more than one shrub here. That's why I'm standing back, try to get the whole thing. Silk tassel grows best as an understory shrub beneath pine, mostly piñon pine and juniper. Occasionally you can find it under oak or other deciduous trees close to a wash, like perhaps cottonwood or maybe sycamore on occasion. But in this region it's going to be growing primarily, if not exclusively, with piñon, juniper, and oak. And so silk tassel is drought resistant, but it does like moisture locales that are cooler in the summer. And it's identifiable in most cases, depending on the species, by this lighter gray-green leaf coloration, and the leaves are very thick and leathery, similar to manzanita. They come to a sharp point, and they're of variable widths and lengths. This species is not coming to me. It'll come back to me, and I'll put it back up on the video and script, but it's one of two species that we have in Arizona. Not Wrightii, but the other one. And so it has opposite leaves and opposite stems with a nice contrast, not as stark as Yerba Santa, but you have this milky yellow, lighter color, and the grayish green leaf, which has a bit of fuzz that you can kind of wipe off, as you can see I'm doing here. But very stiff and rigid leaves. Pretty much the same color, top and bottom. If you get some good sun on them, you can see complexity of the veination. Beautiful leaf. With entire margins, meaning that the margins do not have any waves or teeth to them, and they're smooth. And a little stem to the leaf. And then at this time of year, you could possibly find fruit, maturing fruit. I wouldn't call them edible. They're quite bitter and not really fleshy as they age, but there's a little bit of the purple flesh. They're attractive to anyone who isn't familiar with them, but once you taste them and they're really bitter, they're not so attractive. However, that bitterness is its medicine. It's called silk tassel. Let me pan back for a second before I get into the medicine. It's called silk tassel for this form of the inflorescence. So it's tassel-like. The other species I mentioned, Garrya wrightii, has a shorter inflorescence. And if you go onto the west coast, there's yet more species of Garrya that can have an inflorescence that hangs down even further, maybe 6, 8, 10, 12 inches on occasion. So it's named in Mexico of a related species. Is one of my favorite plant names to say. Cuauhchichic. Cuauhchichic. And almost as fun to say is to spell it. Cuauchchichic. Cuauchchichic. Cuauhchichic. So Cuauhchichic is a fun name to say, but we can call it silk tassel or Garrya. Garrya was once in the dogwood family, the Cornaceae, and it shares the resemblance to other dogwoods by the opposite leaves and stems. However, it's for some time now been moved into its own family, the Garryaceae. That's two R's, Garrya. Bulgaria. So that's the genus. I don't believe there are any other genera in this family. It's just strictly this one. And you can see the young stems have a greenish yellow color. Not getting really good light under here, under the canopy, or focus for that matter, but I think you can pick out the coloration. Occasionally there's a bit of red tinged into this new growth right there. And there you can see the opposite stems. Occasionally they look alternate, like here, simply because the opposite stem has fallen off. Here's some old branches where we see the opposite. So I believe these are pretty long-lived, and they are resistant to fire to the extent that if burnt completely above ground, they'll resprout. And I'm trying to give you a view of the root ball. That root ball often sticks up above the ground a bit where all these stems come off of it, so it kind of pushes its way up out of the ground. I would imagine this shrub is several decades old. And you see its bark, which has a slightly pinkish gray-brown tone to it, and then can also be mottled as it begins to grow. So somewhat diverse in its presentation, the stems and bark. Goes through various stages. So it's a unique plant and has particular value to us, and that it is a strong, astringent herb that has other complex medicine contributing to that effect. So one of the traditional applications of silk tassel, there we go. One of the traditional medicinal applications of silk tassel is dysentery. So it's an astringent, but it also has a nervous system effect that can stop and inhibit dysentery. And some have claimed or argued that there is an additional antimicrobial effect that may be contributing to its inhibition of diarrhea or dysentery, and to the extent that they may use the leaves, fruits, or tinctures in suspect water when camping or traveling in the wilds to be able to drink from river or spring water. Just a few leaves in some water or a tincture, a squirt of tincture into a quart of water to render pathogenic microbes inert or incapable of infecting us. I don't know. That's a theory that some have proved correct, but it's an easy one to prove correct when there are no pathogens or when your body has the vitality to limit these pathogens. Another plant that I rely upon wholeheartedly is Castella or Chaparro amargosa for this effect. It is quite proven as a prophylactic and as a therapeutic once the infection takes hold. So I'm not aware of anyone using silk tassel for an active protozoal or amoebic type of dysentery infection. But it is a fantastic antispasmodic. So you can see there's several ways where it could help by relieving diarrhea, relieving spasm, thereby providing comfort. And we'd like to think that it's antimicrobial as well, and it may be, at least to some extent. But the leaf tea is quite bitter, so it's mostly used as a tincture. And so women may use it around menses where there's painful spasming and cramping. I sometimes combine it at about 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 with our Gemini or prickly poppy, which can be found throughout the Southwest as a pain reliever. And so those two together work really well. I use this new leaf growth when I'm harvesting, things that I've been showing you already, like this segment right here. There's a nice big one. That entire bit would be cut and chopped up and used. I can make it fresh, but I generally do it dry, so I can then put the leaves into some kind of grinder, Vitamix blender to chop them up. You certainly can't chop these with a knife, not without a great deal of effort. And you could chop them with, say, pruners or scissors, but that would definitely take a long time, even when fresh. So I like to dry them and then grind them up to a near powder with a Vitamix, but not a fine powder, just small pieces. And then tincture that with 50% alcohol. Any species of Garrya that I'm familiar with, from central Texas to California, can all be used. So, although Garrya is found throughout these places, there's great distances in between its stands, and then when you find it, it can be tremendously abundant. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands of plants in this valley alone. So it's a great plant to know. Not a huge array of applications, but what it does really well. So get to know your local stands of Garrya. And another thing I want to point out, I'm going to take a broad view of this area just to give you an idea of the plant community. We have silk tassel beneath the piñon, and all the tall trees out here are piñon, as far as my eye can see and make out. And there's another silk tassel right in the center of the frame, surrounded by big sagebrush, the light colored gray-green, Mormon tea or ephedra, which is in the center frame right now, a different species than what we saw in the lower Mojave. And another plant we've discussed here at length, Yerba Santa, Eriodictyon. Here's some more young silk tassel. One of the ways to tell silk tassel from manzanita, which is easy to confuse, there's various species of manzanita with varying leaf shape. They are all alternately leaved. So if it's opposite and has this appearance in this chaparral habitat, you've found some silk tassel or Garrya species. Just right here, there's about 7 or 8 plants. And right next to it, a single thick trunk with numerous stems coming off of it. Here's a plant, not the exact species, but a related species to what we discussed on in my Mogollon Rim, Oak Woodlands Conifer Forest virtual plant walk from last month. It's a species of Ceanothus, quite distinct from the one that we viewed in the Mogollon Rim class. So I'll just go into some of the features of it. There's a nice shot of the fruits. So you see the calyces that are persisting like a 6-pointed star around the fruit, which is still maturing. Unless I'm not seeing so well. Yeah, that is the fruit is round on top and then comes down to a point, almost like a short, wide top, flat top. Yeah. And each little flower is on its own stem. Each little fruit is on its own stem. But this species, which is Ceanothus gregii, or I've also seen it changed to Passiflorus. Let me refocus here. Is very clearly, not so clearly, but yeah, hopefully that's clear, that it is opposite stemmed. Opposite stemmed. The leaves occur on whorls opposite each other along the stem, but the stems are very clearly opposing. So that's one of the main things that differentiates this species of Ceanothus. That, and if I can get close to the leaf and see it well enough. Sorry for the jostling. Yeah, so the veination on this species of Ceanothus is unique in that the secondary vein, so there's a primary vein along the meridian of the leaf, and then the secondary veins start all along the leaf, kind of like branches on it, start all along the center midvein, along the midvein. Whereas every other species of Ceanothus that I'm aware of in North America, those secondary veins start at the base of the midvein. And there's only, well, I shouldn't say, it's not so exclusive, but let me rephrase that. The secondary veins that begin at the base of the midleaf extend all the way towards the top or the apex of the leaf. Here you have multiple that do proceed somewhat parallel to each other with a curve upward. So in that regards it is similar, but there are many more of them than normal, moving more towards the outer edge of the leaf than quite distinctly towards the tip. So it's a subtle thing, but a difference between all other species of redroot by my experience. And then very clearly little tiny sharp teeth on the edge of these thick, leathery, tiny leaves. It's another distinct difference between this species of Ceanothus. The leaves are much more leathery in the desert species than Ceanothus fendleri, which we saw in the Mogollon Rim. Those are soft leaves that nonetheless are persistent year-round. I should say they're more tender. I'll just pan out a bit again. This is about 6 or 7 feet tall. So I would say somewhere in the range of 3 to 8 feet tall, the largest ones, but yeah, 5 to 6.5 feet is the common size. This one is certainly more upright in a V, which is not always the case. It can be more outwardly erratic in its growth. And this is a little too mature in my book to gather the root, but the root is what is generally gathered from Ceanothus species. However, I have made tincture of the young flowering leafing tips of this species, so I would suggest trying that before digging a root. Especially of a plant this size, I would leave this alone and seek to otherwise gather roots from smaller examples of this species. Okay, and now we're going to wrap up this section of the Mojave Desert virtual plant walk with sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata. This right here is an older specimen of sagebrush. You can see that it's gone to flower already. So these flower stalks generally grow up above the foliage. So sagebrush is probably the most widespread shrub in Western North America. And so it's a really important plant to know for that fact. It may not grow immediately within your area as it's outside of most major metropolitan areas. You won't find it in Las Vegas, in Albuquerque proper, or Phoenix, or Tucson, or even Los Angeles, but it is within close range of all those places, and as well as Denver and Cheyenne and elsewhere north and west, because it's so useful. And sagebrush can be used internally, but is most often used topically and externally in a wide variety of ways. But there are plenty of good reasons to use it internally as well. So looking at it in this state, in fact, there's old inflorescences and there's actually some young new inflorescences. Artemisia have nearly unrecognizable inflorescences unless you have really sharp eyes or you bring out a loupe. So it can be difficult to tell by sight of the flower, but what you'll see is that the plants become more stringy, more thin and wispy, whereas when they first start leafing out in the spring, they're much thicker. The foliage is much thicker. And in this specimen right in front of us here, we see that mostly in the beige, dried out foliage, subtending or beneath the green foliage. So that was thicker, lusher, more juicy, larger plant material that did a lot of the work of photosynthesis to prime the plant into this outpouring of inflorescences. Like most plants, once it turns its attention, especially a perennial plant, once it shifts its energy into reproduction, flowering and seed production, the rest of the foliage diminishes in its size and fullness. And my experience, generally speaking, it's less complex in its phytoconstituents, the foliage that is. So I would prefer gathering the foliage from sagebrush just prior to flowering when the lush fullness of the vegetation is at its height. However, if you need it and you're available and it's available to you now at this state, then go ahead and use it. In fact, even if all of the vegetation was dry and you only had dry leaves and inflorescence stems and twigs, I would, so long as it's all relatively alive, the plant itself is alive, I would gather that to use it as well. But high grading, I would seek to gather the foliage just prior to flowering. And that can be done with a pruners and clip it off. And then from there, there's just so many things we can do. Topically, I've used that as a first aid in numerous situations where there's a cut, burn, bite, injury. It can be applied as a poultice, fresh plant mashed up. If you've dried the plant, then you can powder it up and moisten that powdered herb with some hot water, just a little bit to get it moistened. If you have some flax or chia seed that you can grind up along with it to create some cohesiveness with the moistened herb, you could apply that as a wet poultice to pull out heat, to calm inflammation in skin, connective tissue, muscles. You can apply it to wounds as an antiseptic. White sage is a phenomenal, sagebrush. White sage is definitely a phenomenal antiseptic, but sagebrush is a phenomenal antiseptic as well. And since I mentioned white sage, that is a salvia species in the mint family, Lamiaceae, whereas sagebrush is an artemisia, Artemisia tridentata. And so Artemisia is in the Asteraceae, white sage or salvia is in the Lamiaceae, the mint family. So salvias and artemisias are unrelated botanically. However, the plant family makes similar constituents throughout. So something, I can't think of an exact constituent off the top of my head, but there can be at least similar smelling constituents between white sage and sagebrush, if not actually shared constituents. But the complete picture is going to be quite different from one to the other. Nonetheless, we had Western moving pioneers, especially in the 19th century, familiar with sage, and botanists moving out in this direction. And upon encountering sagebrush, it was reminiscent to them of the smell of sage. And so it's gotten that name. Same thing with other species of Artemisia. namely Artemisia ludoviciana, related to sagebrush, but quite different in many regards in its medicine, yet there's a lot of overlap. That species too, Artemisia ludoviciana, has also been referred to as a sagewort, prairie sage, mountain sage. I believe Lakota will call it Sundance sage. And so sagebrush, or big sagebrush that we're looking at here, is perhaps the Artemisia otherwise most commonly referred to as a sage, whereas it's not a true sage, not a true salvia. But I mentioned its species name, and I should go back in a little bit tighter so you can see the 3 teeth. That's where it gets its species name, tridentata. So there's 3 teeth at the end of each leaf. So that makes this one relatively easy to identify. However, the youngest leaves may not have any teeth, but certainly the older leaves will, and vast majority of leaves on the plant will. And of course, it can look a little bit different from place to place. There's some plants, older plants in Utah, that are 8 to 10 feet tall that you can park a truck under, and then throughout much of the northern Arizona desert, Colorado Plateau desert, sagebrush may only be 2 to 3 feet in height and throughout great distances. But sagebrush, as I mentioned, has strong antiseptic qualities, and for that it can be used both topically and internally. An example internally would be for a sore throat that you would gargle with some of the hot tea, or for ulcerative conditions of the stomach, a cold tea may be beneficial. The cold tea will also help stimulate digestion. So you make either a cold infusion of the herb or a hot infusion that then is left to cool. And drinking just a couple ounces of that should adequately stimulate digestion. Artemisias are often complex in their qualities and how those are evoked in our bodies. So depending on tissue states and current conditions and individuals' constitutions and the environmental conditions, they can manifest as either hot or cold. So in the case that we drink a cold tea of Artemisia, it may stimulate our digestion, thus being classified as a warming response. However, we could have an inflammatory state on a wound, or even an immunological, well, in both cases they're immunological, a wound or a rash type condition, and then sagebrush application, say a cold tea again, applied to that will be cooling and soothing. So there's both warming and cooling properties to begin to learn about with sagebrush. So I'm just introducing you to these ideas now, but seemingly paradoxical traits of a plant does not mean that the plant is erratic. It means that there's a depth of complexity to understanding its medicine before we can become fully successful in the applications of these medicines. Because in some cases we want to apply a cooling remedy when something's hot, and sometimes when something's so hot, say a boil or cellulitis, especially in hot weather, applying a hot compress would be most effective. So that's another application. You can make a hot tea of sagebrush and then apply that as a fomentation or compress, in essence soaking a small cloth in the hot tea and applying that directly to the affected area, the cellulitis or the boil, similar types of issues, and then cover that, causing the heat to rise and bring it to a head, so to speak, literally with the boil, and cellulitis somewhat figuratively. But sagebrush and creosote bush, I use them, and they're quite different medicines, but they have very similar applications in many ways. So depending on the location in which you have available for such a condition as a boil or cellulitis, I would use either sagebrush or creosote bush similarly. A hot, damp towel over the the fresh crushed herb would also work well, if not the tea, bringing it to a head. Another thing I've experimented with is gathering the fresh herb to dry and then make an oil infusion with for topical application for irritations and also injuries to all tissue to help speed healing, relieve pain, adjust the inflammation so it's not excessive and not too much pain, or even for a chronic injury, an old, long-standing injury. Sagebrush has been traditionally used also for respiratory illnesses. I'm going to shift back and pan out, and you can see some of the remnants of the old sagebrush plants here across the ground. This makes really good firewood, by the way, indicating further its stored heat, the hot quality of sagebrush. Respiratory infections, both as a hot tea and as a steam inhalation. So again, another spot where there's great overlap between creosote bush and sagebrush. Either one of them I would choose to do as a steam inhalation for the acute onset of a respiratory virus. Both phenomenal to either arrest that virus in the early stages, just as it's starting to stimulate immunity in the mucous membranes, or even for more advanced stages and recovery, because of the ability for that steam, for one, to enhance the effects of the mucous membranes, all the vaporized aromatics that work antiseptically, whether it's a virus or a bacteria or a fungus for that matter. Sagebrush would be effective in those respiratory conditions. Or anything addressing the head where the head can be immersed in the steam, so you're taking it in through the mouth, the nose, the eyes, the ears, the skin, the pores of the skin. I feel it's actually a really good treatment for the skin, revitalizing the skin, perhaps in some small way managing the microflora of the skin, creating suppleness in the skin. And incidentally, you could do that for the whole body as well. A full body bath in sagebrush tea to regulate inflammation, to relieve the itch and sting of excessive insect bites in the summertime, chiggers or mosquitoes or black flies, whatever it may be, or to relieve arthritic joints or painful joints from chronic inflammatory condition. So sagebrush is something that you really can't find on the market, but for small herbal companies integrating it into boutique products. But it is abundant, and we can go out and gather. So there's always more to say on sagebrush, but I think on that last point, I'll wrap up with a few words about relationship, because that's something that I haven't really addressed in this plant walk, and that's the difficulty of doing short, immersive studies of the local flora without a context. And so I always appreciate contextual awareness for anything. And in this case, the contextual awareness is that we are living beings, just as the plant is a living being. And when we come to partake of its medicine, and we address the plant with some degree of respect and honor as we are capable of, that initiates a relationship of reciprocity by which the plant feels seen. And of course, we begin to appreciate the plant by the effects which it has on us, whether it's standing before the plant and appreciating its beauty, perhaps losing ourselves, our troubles, in the beauty that the plant presents to us through its visual, tactile, aromatic, flavor, and so forth, that we begin to, these are the gateway sensory portals by which we step into the worlds of the plants. And so again, to reiterate, it's through honor and respect by which we develop a reciprocal relationship with plants. Yes, we can go and take from plants and receive benefit. However, it is my belief and my experience that that benefit will be relatively limited, you might say superficial, or perhaps, to finish that thought, if we approach the plant without any degree of respect or appreciation or gratitude. Yet, if we were to do that, we could very well come back around to appreciating that plant through some degree of humility, which the plant may very well induce as it begins to heal us. And healing us physically may be the first step towards mental and emotional healing that we require. And our interactions with the natural world are essential steps for many of us to begin to receive the healing that's available to us. So in this way, it's less about the constituents and the effects on the tissues, although that's beneficial. It's an orchestrated whole. But certainly our minds are greater than we perhaps imagine, and when we bring our hearts and minds together in the gathering of the herb, this relationship of reciprocity emerges and unfolds and deepens and enriches our lives. And further deepens our knowledge and understanding and awareness of the plants. So hopefully some of those words may inspire you to review your relationship with plants, or encourage you to move in the direction that you already feel compelled to with plants and explore that more fully from a place within yourself. You don't have to have an upbringing to dictate how that goes. You can simply move about the natural landscape from your own heart center, feeling, sensing, and responding with authenticity. The plants will respond in kind. So what's most important here is that I encourage you to go out and have these relationships with plants, to have these experiences and develop these relationships with plants. And in the process, you may actually be able to apply some of this knowledge, but my words and what I share with you is simply facilitating a doorway, a portal, a threshold. And beyond that, a much greater world can open up for each individual. So I hope you enjoyed this short sharing I've been able to offer here in this diverse Mojave Desert habitat near Las Vegas. I look forward to doing more. And you can check out some of my other videos on my website, currently addressing the Sonoran Desert, the Mogollon Rim of Arizona, which extends down from northwestern Arizona down towards southwestern New Mexico, and a recent addition in the Rocky Mountains in Utah, in the Wasatch Forest, and certainly more to come. So from Mojave Desert and Sagebrush, we say adios until next time.